What do they see in me? Louis asked himself. What? Doesn't she know who I am? Louis knew exactly who he was. A man addicted to heroin for most of his life, whose drive to feed his addiction took over his life entirely. My life, he said, became a continual search for the drug. When my mother was dying, I never visited her because I was too busy looking for my next fix. He was a man who spent most of his life in and out of prison. And when he wasn't in prison, he would disappear for a year at a time just to hide away from anyone who would dare to reach out to him. He knew he was worthless. But he wasn't worthless to Lori Gonzalez, a suburban housewife and mother of 3 children who volunteered at her church's homeless shelter. Lori had been volunteering for a while at the shelter when she was pushed into serving gravy in the food line and came face to face for the first time with the people who came to that shelter. No longer, you see, were they anonymous people, because she began to look into their eyes. She began praying for them, and then, as she said, I felt touched by the Spirit of God telling me I had to know their names. I realized that these were people who others kept at a distance, and getting to know their names meant a lot. That was the day I found my calling, serving gravy at a homeless shelter. Might seem like a strange, kind of an odd place to hear God's call, let alone be a suburban housewife in Southern California who makes friends with drug addicts and homeless men and women, and whose dream ministry is to start a shelter for the homeless with her family and name it Louie's Place in honor of her friend Louie, who heard his own call from God during rehab and who now struggles a lot, he says. But each day is still a challenge, but I am getting stronger every day, and life is much better now. Because now he has his own apartment, a full-time job, and on the weekends he spends his time doing maintenance at Glenkirk Church, where the homeless shelter Lori serves is located. A drug addict and a suburban housewife, 2 very different people living very different lives, and yet God calls both to change, to transform lives. But we might wonder, well, why does God do that? Why would God choose those 2 people? Well, it's inexplicable. We can't explain it because we don't have ready-made answers to why God chooses to do a lot of things that God chooses to do. But then maybe that's the answer. God does inexplicable things. I mean, think about it for a moment. God chooses to call Paul to be Christ's ambassador to the Gentiles. I mean, here's a guy who is the Pharisees' Pharisee, and he will say that in his letters, by the way. He was a zealot for his faith, and in his zeal he was prompted to work for the purity of the faith by getting rid of those blasphemers speaking about Jesus as Lord, Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as God. Saul, his name before God changed it for him, was absolute in his certainty that he understood whom these people were and what to do about them. He based his life on the assumption that the survival of God's people depended upon making sure that God's welcome was extended only to the limited number of people for which it was meant. He wasn't, by the way, being a closed-minded jerk, as he has been sometimes categorized and described as. He wasn't just thinking about preserving his own status. In his eye, he was acting to ensure the survival of his people, the survival of his family in the broadest and noblest sense. And so he did go about breathing threats and murder against the disciples. There was not any room, by the way, for disagreement. There wasn't even a little bit of tolerance in the, let's agree to disagree. This was the serious business of getting these people who were destroying the faith either to renounce their discipleship or to get them out of the synagogue before they brought everything to an end. And he was on his way to Damascus with a letter of authority from the temple high priest to arrest anyone suspected of being a follower of the way, being a follower of Christ. His plan as he rode to Damascus that day on that road was to hurry to Damascus, find these people, arrest them, bring them back in chains to Jerusalem for a quick and speedy short trial before punishing them as he knew they deserved to be punished. Saul was not uncertain about what he was doing and why he was doing it. Saul was dead certain he was right. Now, if you've ever tried to persuade someone of Saul's temperament to change his or her mind, that you know that it's a hard thing to do. As a matter of fact, Rabbi and family systems therapist Edwin Friedman has described it this way. He has said, never in the history of the world has a wife said to her husband, "Dear, you need to change this behavior or that behavior," and have the husband say, "Well, thank you for pointing that out to me. I will be glad to change my way." It's a hard thing to do. Bless you. And maybe that's why the only way God could get Saul's attention was with a blinding flash of light in the middle of the day, in the middle of the road on the way to Damascus. A light so blinding that Saul was unable to see during and after the encounter with Christ, who asked Saul the million-dollar question, "Why are you persecuting me?" Now, all of a sudden, you see, the central question for his life is not about who is worthy enough to join the people of God, but how quickly all of the people of the world can be gathered together at the table to break bread with Jesus in a foretaste of the feast that will never end. Suddenly, he's no longer the Saul the Pharisee, but Paul the blind man laying in bed waiting for the blindness somehow to be lifted off his eyes so that he can really see what is truly real. But Paul isn't the only one whom God inexplicably chose to call. Peter was probably the last person anyone in his village would have thought would be put in charge of anything. He was a fisherman, not a very high status job in the first century. And he was known to be somewhat of a speak first, think later kind of a guy who would just as likely was going to be wrong as he was to be right, and even if he was right, he wouldn't know exactly why he might be right. The central question in Peter's life was, will I catch enough fish today so everyone can be fed? And each day he set out to answer that question. And some days that question was, yes, I caught enough to feed everybody today. And sometimes the answer was, well, not quite. And then Jesus comes along after his resurrection, and Peter and the boys have so much fish the boat is about to sink. And then Jesus asked Peter that question, "Do you love me?" And suddenly the central question for Peter's life is, can I gather the fullness of the flock that I am called to feed with the unlimited blessings God has for every person in the world? Can I do that? Paul and Peter, Louis and Lori are not the only ones God has inexplicably called. John Wesley was a proper little Oxford Don, a priest, a devout Christian who devoted his life to study and the proclamation of the gospel. Problem was, he had no fire for the gospel. He had no passion for the gospel. And after a disastrous stint as a missionary in Georgia, that would be our Georgia, he went back to London. And then he went, in his words, unwillingly to a meeting in Aldersgate Street in London. And there, while someone was reading Luther's pretty dull commentary on Paul's letter to the church at Rome, Wesley's heart was strangely warmed, he said. His soul struck fire and the Wesleyan revival began. It was for Wesley just like Saul on the Damascus Road. And then there was the writer Anne Braden, who grew up in the Old South in a privileged family in the 1930s. As a college student, she had dinner one night with an African-American woman. And there at the table, sharing a meal together, her life was transformed. In words worthy of Paul, she would later write, "It was a tremendous revelation, the turning point of my life. All the cramping walls of a lifetime seemed to have come tumbling down in that moment. Some heavy shackles seemed to have fallen from my feet, and for the first time in my 19 years on this earth, I felt I had room to stretch my arms and my legs and lift my head high toward the sky. Here for a moment I glimpsed a vision of the world as it should be, where people are people and spirits have room to grow. I never got over it." One of my professors at Columbia Theological Seminary when I was doing my doctoral work was Barbara Brown Taylor. You might have read one of her books, heard her preach somewhere. And she told us of a time when she was on a seminary admissions committee. And they had turned this student down, a student who obviously had very few academic qualifications for theological study. But he wrote them from his jail cell to tell them that the parole board would let them out if they would let him in. And so they invited him to plead his case before them. And Barbara describes how this big guy came in and told them that as a young teenager he had held up a convenience store. And all that he remembered was brandishing an unloaded gun at the clerk when an off-duty police officer spotted him, and then somehow shots rang out. And then before the oak table of this very serious seminary admissions committee, he pulls up his shirt to show them where the policeman's bullet hit him in his stomach and then went out the other side. That, he said, was my Damascus Road. That was my burning bush, he exclaimed. And of course, said Barbara, we didn't want to admit him into seminary, but what could we do? We all knew Acts 9. And that if God could make an apostle out of Saul the murderer, what might God do with a guy with a gun? It was just sort of an inexplicable thing that God, who would raise Jesus from the dead, just might do. The really inexplicable call, though, the real inexplicable call that God is making is happening to someone here this morning. Someone sitting next to you in this sanctuary has been hearing the small, still voice speaking quietly to him or to her. Someone sitting next to you in this sanctuary has heard God's inexplicable call through the voice of a husband, a wife, maybe, as odd as this might be, even me. Someone sitting in this sanctuary at this moment is feeling that strange warming sensation that Wesley described, or maybe just the feeling of the Spirit of God moving through them, pushing, prodding, grabbing hold of them and showing them the world as it should be and will be through the grace of God. Right here, right now, the God who raised Jesus from the dead is doing what God does, making the inexplicable call that will transform the central question of somebody's life. And that person just might be asking the same question that everybody, including me, asks. Ask God when we hear that call. God, are you kidding? Do you know who I am? Amen.